at a high level, the idea too is that if Fedimint is a system for building financial applications and Nostr is a system that's leveraging those to build other applications, that there's a lot of crossover synergies between user bases between the two things.
So obviously I've been spending all my time trying to learn more about Nostr. And in that process, a good friend of mine who's quite knowledgeable about this stuff said, "You're excited about Nostr, but you don't know anything about Fedimint? That's crazy." So I said, well, okay, let me go learn something about Fedimint. And I saw that Don, who I've hung out with, made videos with before, knew something about it because he was tweeting about it. So I chimed in with him and said, hey, let's get together so I can learn. And he pulled in Eric Yakes, who has a lot of depth and a lot of research in this area. So we decided to put this together. It's the majority of the beginning of it. We're focused on learning about Fedimint and just getting the basics of what this is. And it's not very directly Nostr related, but then we actually talk about what are some of the overlap or kind of the touch points where it might overlap with Nostr. So I decided to put it here on Nostr Talks anyway, because I thought that it's relevant to everything that we like to learn together here. And so hope you enjoy the conversation.
And Fedimint seems, I mean, I've heard about it. I have a friend who's kind of more involved and closely, using it and closer to some of the people involved. And he keeps telling me, oh, you got to get into this. You got to dig in. And then he's like, I can't believe you're spending all this time on Nostr and you're not spending any time on Fedimint. You're crazy. So I have like a very high level understanding of kind of conceptually what it is and what some of the goals are, but I don't really know anything. I'm like super noob at it. And so I'd like to hear both like what do you guys know about it and what are you excited about? And then also if it has a very obvious connection to Nostr, that would be interesting to hear. But if it doesn't and it's just something else interesting in the world, that's fine too. So where's
Yeah. I can jump into some of it around it. I think the tricky thing about Fedimint is there's a lot of different lenses from which you can view it through. You can say this is a new form of custodial hardware that we're structuring for financial applications. You can also say that it's a new layer of programmability, and it's going to enable a lot of financial applications to be built that are a bit more challenging on like the Bitcoin Lightning set. And then you can talk about it from more of like a monetary perspective of it's effectively creating a new form of monetization for Bitcoin in certain ways. It's also, creating eCash for the privacy benefits. I think that the way that it's pushed publicly often kind of focuses on the privacy side of it. But, in terms of what Don and I, when we were getting into the research, I think what really sold me is actually, it's a bit more of the, kind of like a business aspect to it, where like in the Lightning ecosystem, as well as on like, base chain for companies that are being built, when you're talking to founders, everybody's got their own business development plan, and they're all trying to find ways to capture users and, find a user base in various different ways. And I think what's kind of compelling about what's going to be built on Fedimint is that they have like a pretty structured plan for business development and user capture, and they're trying to use the protocol as a method to generate a user base that ultimately developers, when they're building on Fedimint, they can immediately plug into that user base. So if Fedi, the company, is successful in garnering a lot of users at a global level, then it'll be a lot more simplified process for founders, because they can say, okay, well, we already have this user base in there. We have streamlined methods for if we build our application, we can be tapping into that user base pretty quickly. And that's going to simplify the process of development pretty significantly. You're not going to have to be as focused on the business development side. So like, that's kind of like a high level. Yeah.
Yeah. I think already, like, I think I kind of get some of where that goes. But I wonder if we could actually, take it back to somebody. Like, let's assume I know most of the basics of Bitcoin and I maybe have played with Lightning, and then I heard there's a thing called Fedimint.
Yep.
So start from the beginning.
Kind of from the beginning.
Yeah.
And maybe even part of it is like how you guys came to get excited about it. Because I'm sort of in the spot of that person I just described.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of like one of the problems that Fedimint solves is, in describing just what Fedimint is in general first, right? So it's kind of an easy way to think about it is it's like a community custody model for Bitcoin. So as opposed to either storing your Bitcoin on an exchange with a custodian where you have no control over those private keys, right? You're just hoping that the custodian will keep it safe for you and then give it back to you whenever you want it. or kind of the other extreme of, self-custody, where you are storing your Bitcoin on like a hardware wallet. Maybe you have multi-signature setup where you're kind of splitting your key quorum up to have some redundancy there. Fedimint kind of sees itself as kind of a midway point in that custody model. So instead of trusting like a Coinbase or a Binance with your Bitcoin, the idea behind Fedimint is this can be like a community custody model. So a federation could be stood up, and the federation is consisting of what's called guardians. So the guardians are in charge of basically running the Fedimint protocol software, standing up whatever hardware is needed to run that software, and then being in control of the eCash that's issued when users join that specific mint. So,
and what is
probably
I've heard eCash thrown around, and I've heard people talk about Chaum mints, and that's kind of the genesis of this, but I don't really know what that means. Like, what is eCash compared to just, I don't know, Lightning payments or something? Yep.
So yeah, eCash, I think the first iteration of eCash was developed in the 80s. Is that right, Eric?
Yeah. It was, and like David Chaum was kind of like, the grandfather of like this like vision for a lot of the direction that eCash ultimately went. I mean, that was kind of like the goal that the cypherpunks were looking into, was develop a form of eCash until we got to Bitcoin.
Yep. And kind of the problem with it was that you still had to trust somebody, right? And so
meaning whoever was the issuer of the cash.
Exactly. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
But so we have this problem kind of already solved with Bitcoin and Lightning. At least to me, it feels like it's not perfect yet, but we're on the path to having something like an eCash. But then I hear the term eCash always come up when we talk about Fedimints. So why are we reintroducing what's maybe an older term? Is there something that some new feature that or some old feature that those held over that is now kind of revitalized?
Yeah, I can speak to that. It's so like the problem with when so the company was called Digicash was when he tried to monetize the idea, and the problem that they had is they were basically taking dollars and they were pegging it, to a value of eCash. So that worked when you had trusted servers, and that's fine if you want to trust the traditional financial system. What Bitcoin solved is it created a digitally native form of money. So like the idea is that the benefits of eCash were that we had this very private form of transacting, which is, a lot of people call it a digital bearer instrument. It's close, but you're still dependent upon the servers and transactions, so you can't quite call it that. But nonetheless, you created this very private form of transacting. Now that we have Bitcoin, we can use that as the digitally native form of money that's backing it, and then we can issue eCash on top of it, and that gives us the further benefits while not having to trust the US dollar financial system.
I see. And so is it when we say eCash, are we talking about like it's pegged to like a US dollar? Is that the core piece that maybe isn't in the rest of Bitcoin Lightning land?
Right. So it's not pegged to the dollar. So it's pegged to Bitcoin, and it's not necessarily like pegged either. That's the key thing. Like it's, and this is where I think a lot of controversy will probably emerge around it, and what a lot of my research into like, free banking systems, how I think it could still work at scale pretty well, but it's a tough theoretical topic. But nonetheless, there is no blockchain within eCash. It's just a spare instrument that gets issued. So like, a federation is composed of software that speaks Bitcoin, it speaks Fedimint, and that means that it also speaks eCash and Chaum mints.
Sorry, Eric. Talk about the problems with Bitcoin that Fedimint solves, right? Why do we need eCash?
Yeah. So, I mean, primarily for like just the privacy properties of eCash, that's a really big value add. I mean, the only other solution that seems to make sense is like zero knowledge rollups, and those are much harder to implement in practice. Like we see a lot of implementations of those over in Ethereum. They all necessitate, it's a very complex system. It requires development. You have to have backdoor access by developers if you want those systems to be constantly iterating. So the benefits of zero knowledge rollups are kind of undermined by the fact that you still have to keep it centralized during the development process. And then if we even were to implement that within Bitcoin, it would require a soft fork, and that has a lot of implications for how that would impact, MEV on the base chain, and the incentives just on Bitcoin itself. So whether or not that soft fork would even ever occur to get those privacy benefits, it's like, okay, well, how do we get it today in a way that provides the proper user experience other than, having to use mixing services and things like that and a ton of education? eCash is kind of like a really big solution to that. Also, by creating this type of system of eCash, it makes it much easier for us to create a programmability layer for financial applications that are leveraging the eCash directly, and it's not constrained by the rules of Bitcoin and Lightning. So those are kind of like the two primary things I'd say.
eCash is a bearer instrument, and it's focused on privacy. Is that a good kind of a good summary?
Yeah, so like the way that I'm trying to explain it is basically you have servers with a multi-sig, and those servers will speak Bitcoin, they'll speak Fedimint, which is eCash, and they have the ability to where you send your Bitcoin to the multi-sig address of those servers. They will issue you eCash in return that's commensurate with that value. So you'll now have, like, if you do it from your cell phone, they'll send you that eCash directly to your cell phone. There is no blockchain or anything associated with it. You just have eCash sitting on your phone. If you lose your phone, then that eCash would be gone. But like within the Fedimint protocol, they have a backup system where you effectively like shard ownership of that eCash amongst the servers as well. But how the eCash actually gets transferred and what enables trust within the federation is that if I send my eCash stored on my phone to you and it's now stored on your phone, there's a verification process of settlement at the federation where I send it to you. Once I have the eCash on my phone, how do I know that you didn't just copy that eCash on your phone and send me one of them? You will immediately within the transaction, it checks with the Federation servers who all have like a list that they hold of eCash issued. And it'll say, okay, you have this eCash. We're going to refresh it with a new eCash that person can't double spend. So it has a double spending mechanism that's used. And that's why it's kind of hard to call it like a bearer instrument completely. Like if you compare it to like cash, when I give you a dollar bill, there's no centralized party that we have to adjust and refresh the dollar bill with. So it's not quite a bearer instrument, but in terms of a lot of the properties of transacting, it effectively acts in the same way.
I see. So is the mint the right way sorry, I'm kind of like learning this all from scratch. So hopefully.
Yeah, totally.
But is the mint, is one way to think of it is kind of like the function that a bank or maybe even like that a bank might have in the world today?
Yep.
Where they maybe issue like IOUs in a sense, but they are backed, hopefully. I mean, there's fractional reserve in the banking system. And I think if I understand it correctly, in this system, there's not fractional reserve, right?
Well, it's, fractional reserve is a market phenomenon, right? So it's the idea is that with Lightning, we wouldn't have fractional reserve because it's by the requirements of the protocol that's enabled. Now there's trade-offs to having a system like that. We have to have, you have to put your Bitcoin into a hot wallet to utilize it. You have to have capacity limitations, which might lead towards centralization of the network over time. So I think like what's compelling about the eCash side is that you're giving up that risk. Like there is a potential that you could have like a rogue server that starts implementing or issuing more eCash than Bitcoin they've received in their multi-sig address. And that could be a big problem. I think though, when you get into the details of like the economic side of it, that at a minimum, you could see this exist as a functioning system where there might be some degree of fractional reserve. But, I argue in my writing a bit more about this, which is a complicated argument, but I think that the properties of a digitally native system could actually make the system so efficient that the free market incentives to want to produce a fractional reserve system may not even be possible. But nonetheless, that is a risk of this system. And I think that like that'll be one of the key challenges as to whether or not people want to accept the benefits of privacy and programmability that'll come from it and still be, trusting their particular federation. And then one other point I'll add on that is like the idea around what Don was saying with the middle way that they're trying to find in terms of custody between third-party custody and self-custody is that, when you it was like probably what I was most critical of when I first heard about Fedimint, is I was like, okay, well, we could probably just focus on optimizing for self-custodial practices. And I think that the big problem with that is that, you know, all of this comes down to user experience. And as much as we want that to happen and as much as we educate, it's just not a realistic perspective to assume that everybody in the world will self-custody one day. I think that there will be various compromises that are made. And I think that with the idea of trust, fundamentally, trust isn't something that we want, but it's certainly something that we can optimize for. And when you think about third-party custody, it's definitely not being optimized for. There's not much of a social cost towards, a third party not acting in your best interest. If you're storing with FTX International, right, and there's not even a legality that can really back you up in a lot of different ways, then it's really just dependent upon a profit motive. So once that profit motive is gone and the system's crumbling, I mean, you're basically screwed.
What if I try to summarize at least what I understand so far? So there's the large centralized providers of custody, and those have problems that you don't have a direct relationship with the people. They could exit scam or defraud you, and they don't really care. And that's sort of that's the FTXs of the world or the Coinbases of the world. There's a lot of trust that's kept with people who you don't really have a direct relationship with. So there's problems with that model. And the other extreme is self-custody and self-sovereignty and ownership of your private keys and management of that is very challenging for even fairly technical people. And so we don't believe that the future is going to include everybody doing that at all times. And so if I understand right, Fedimint is intended to create something in between where there is some trust in a third party, but it's a third party who you hopefully have a closer relationship with and who has more responsibility to you and to making sure that your custody is handled appropriately, and they don't have as much of a big broad scale profit motive as they have maybe they're a community elder or a respected, citizen within a community who would be trusted with that. So is that the right setup at least? That's the basics of why Fedimint should exist.
Right. Yeah. The idea is they're trying to optimize for trust. And if we're going to trust, there's the better way of doing it, which is kind of the way we've naturally evolved based on communities.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I would add the other part too is as Bitcoin continues to scale, right, the way that the base chain and even Lightning are structured today, there's no way we could onboard the entire world to a Bitcoin standard. And so Fedimint comes in and they say, we're planning that, 10, 15 years from now, whatever it is, the majority of the world is going to be using Bitcoin in their day-to-day lives. How do we structure a model that can account for that and also bring the benefit of privacy, which is something that Bitcoin lacks today? And that's kind of where the eCash model comes into Fedimint as well. So we have, a bunch of community banks, for lack of a better word, around the world that are set up to be as big or as small as, the people running them want them to be. And then all of the folks in their network can opt in and get increased security, increased privacy, and then also increased programmability, right? So the other part of Fedimint is it's not just for custody or privacy. It can also has the ability to build out modules within the Fedimint ecosystem. And so a module can be thought of as an application, right? So just like we were talking about Nostr earlier before we started recording, just like on Nostr, how there are, hundreds, potentially thousands of applications being developed on the protocol, you also have that same ability within Fedimint. So, you have the option to opt into different modules within the Fedimints themselves as well.
Right. So let me ask a couple basic questions. So do you have already a hypothesis or working model of what scale a Fedimint might operate at? So it sounds like one of the things is it can help Bitcoin kind of be useful to more people and handle some scalability things with base chains. And then there's this trade-off of how many people are involved in a particular Fedimint. Do you have sort of a working model or hypothesis from what that looks and feels like?
I don't think that we have a strong idea of what would be the most popular. And I guess it would depend on how you define popular too. But I think that it'll range between like a family-based custodial model where perhaps the parents are the federation, all the way up to commercial scale type federations, which would be more commensurate with something like the liquid side chain, for example. We could have federations set up in that type of a way where maybe if there is some sort of exchange custody that's happening through third parties, it's all being conducted through this federation of exchanges with competing interests who all need to agree upon something so that, it can reduce the chance of fraud occurring.
Okay, so I have a mental model for what a family looks like, and I think that one makes sense. The kind of liquid sidechain one, I don't think I have as strong a mental model. So is that something like maybe in today's world, in the physical world, we have like credit unions that oftentimes have like some trust or association or affiliation that helps them operate in a different way to kind of a big national bank? Is that a reasonable analogy to the kind of liquid example you're giving?
I could say it could even be bigger than that. It's certainly possible that a similar application emerges at that scale too. But I think another way that you could think about it is if, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, and all of them had some sort of settlement system that they were using for their customers. Rather than trusting just one of them, you could have them all provide settlement in some sort of federated type model. That would be at like the far extreme in which it could exist.
That's kind of the largest model that you would imagine.
Yeah. And the thing is too, is like for that kind of a system, the primary reason as of now, I think that may not exist is because you'd probably want to have some sort of side chain of settlement because it would be for a very different use case. So while the technology could be used at that level, it would likely still be something more like a liquid that I would see that would be leveraged for that purpose. And
I've heard of liquid, but I don't know too much about it. So can you help connect the dots with how that relates to Fedimint?
Yeah. So Liquid is just a sidechain. Like the first two primary implementations of sidechains on Bitcoin were RSK and Liquid. They are a similar concept. Like the idea of a federation within Fedimint they got from this type of sidechain model, where they said, okay, if we want to have a chain that also has more programmability and enables us to do other things that Bitcoin limits us on, then we could set up a side chain where we're trusting a federation of parties that are all leveraging that side chain. So it's pretty much like a stakeholder model is the way they set it up. Different companies that are using it for settlement with, either aligned or competing interests at different points in time. Their sign off is required at some threshold in order for funds to be ultimately moved from the side chain back to the base chain. But basically the idea is you take your Bitcoin, you send it to a multi-sig address. It's now pegged in to the side chain, and now a new token is created on that side chain that's pegged 1-to-1, and then that token can be used to conduct economic transactions that you wouldn't be able to do on Bitcoin for more like financially demanding or the resources that are demanded of those things, and the flexibility of the system is greater. So like that was kind of the purpose of it, and it didn't get a ton of traction just because I think that at that scale, the CeFi avenue still made a lot more sense. People didn't see really a ton of value in the trade-off. There's a lot of other reasons I think you can get into as well. But I don't think that we've seen the last of it either. I think as Bitcoin starts to build as more of a reserve asset, we could still see that technology being leveraged in the future.
Yep. And so we have the ideas of kind of how these Fedimints look and at what scale, and there's kind of the uses for them. And you've mentioned programmability and apps. And I'd like to try to build a little bit of basic mental model around what kinds of apps or what kinds of programmability you might imagine could be supported by the Fedimints that we can't do maybe in the rest of kind of Bitcoin or Lightning land.
Yeah, I think that there's, Fedimint recently did a hackathon and some pretty interesting ideas came out of that. I think like fundamentally how to first think about it is like, why wouldn't some of these things just be built on Lightning? And I think the idea, we went back to privacy as a key piece, but also like the channel limitations that you have within Lightning and solving that problem without centralizing the system too much. The eCash type federated model doesn't require any sort of capacity in order to send transactions. So that's a pretty big advantage. You can, because it's just sending eCash over, your bandwidth to another person. Transaction throughput's also still really good. And they effectively have created this system to be able to operate in a really flexible manner because there's less rules with it, right? So like that enables a lot more applications to ultimately be built atop it. And I think like for some of those reasons, it could be the system that's ultimately leveraged that developers would want to build on just because it would be much more simplified.
And you mentioned like a hackathon, there were a bunch of hypotheses or proposals. So it sounds like maybe privacy oriented things that you might otherwise build on Lightning where you demand more privacy, those might show up. So I'm just trying to imagine, is this like a messenger app or a lending app or some other type of service, or how should we sort of think about that?
Yeah, so like practical applications, I think a really big idea that emerged is the idea of like stable sats. So within, there's a lot of controversy around stablecoins. They're demanded for their stability in other countries. Bitcoin is demanded more as like a medium of exchange, not really as a store of value to people like that. So the question's like, okay, do we want to have Bitcoin native stablecoins that are existing, or is there an alternative? And a really interesting idea was stability pools. And they're basically, the idea is that we can pool capital together and create effectively like a derivatives market. It's just a bunch of contracts people set up. You have people who want stability on one side, and you have people who are willing to assume risk to gain upside on their Bitcoin, who will take the other side of the contract. And you could commit to a certain value. You'd say, okay, I just got paid in Bitcoin at 23,000. I want to lock that in for the next month because I'm going to pay for a lot of my, general day-to-day transactions with it. So you find another counterparty who's going to say, okay, we'll lock it in at 23,000, and then the system looks towards like it will require an oracle that would look towards public markets and say, what's the exchange rate of Bitcoin to US dollars? And then at the end of the month, it would settle and say, okay, Bitcoin's gone up to 25,000 since then. You will now pay the person who was assuming risk $2,000 more. And then you still have locked in the stability of your price. Or it could go the other way, and you have Bitcoin goes down to 20,000, and then the person who was assuming risk lost on their bet, and now they're paying you a commensurate amount of Bitcoin to keep that US dollar stability.
And that kind of transaction presumably can't be enforced on any of these systems. It's more of a human enforcement. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So like within these types of pools, it would effectively be the settlement of that in eCash is ultimately determined by the federation upon which that pool exists. So like that would be a good example. If we had an application like that built, it would probably be leveraging a federation that's built more at a commercial scale.
Mm-hmm. And so that would it operate something like, it's almost like, I think about the way maybe a brokerage works, and you have margin calls. You might actually get margin called on this kind of thing, and it would be the people running the Fedimint who would have to adjudicate the risk and figure out who to margin call when.
It wouldn't be based on margin. It's based on like a fully collateralized position. So it's like, it would be like, who the parties that are assuming risk are locking in that proportionate amount of Bitcoin. So the settlement just occurs. It's basically like a smart contract. Like the collateral is locked in. Once the final period is ending, the payouts are conducted based on that. So
let's say you talked about these examples where Bitcoin is in the 23,000 or 25 or $20,000 range. What if during that thing it goes to, I don't know, 5,000 or 100,000? Like who holds that together?
Right. If there's enough people to be, so like you can set the contracts up within like bands of like stops. So like when you get into the complexity around, if like Bitcoin goes to zero or something, then there would be a point at which like the contract stops out and exits. So yeah, you can set it up like that, which would be more of, it's not as much like you are still trusting the federation, but you're trusting how the software is written more so.
Mm-hmm. The other thing too would be like the liquidity providers would most likely in practice be hedged on the other side, right? So they would be providing liquidity and then earning some type of spread, most likely, and they would probably just net out their risk on the other side with a different party.
And are they doing that all within the context of a single Fedimint, or they might be operating across different Fediments they have relationships with?
Yeah, it could be across multiple, which is actually like when we look, how this might look in the future, having like Lightning service providers potentially act as gateways between Fedimints I think is probably the most likely way that plays out. So, you'll have different eCaches between different Fedimints. There will most likely be use cases where you'll want to transfer eCash between Fedimints for different purposes. And
I didn't realize that was allowed. So what is the trust model between? Oh, okay.
I think that's where the Lightning service providers would step in, right? They would effectively be able to charge a fee for changing out your eCash depending on which mint you're wanting to do business with. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So they kind of warehouse a bunch of different eCaches, effectively charge a fee for kind of being the bank in that scenario to help people transact between different Fedimints.
But each Fedimint is itself functioning as a bank and has its own kind of, I don't know if this is the right way to call it, kind of a proprietary eCash that only works within that Fedimint. And then if you have these liquidity providers would be kind of meta banks on top of those banks that hold some liquidity of the proprietary eCaches to make them interchangeable, and they capture some spread for the service they provide.
Exactly. Yeah. The eCash isn't fungible between each federation. So you need a system of effectively intermediaries, and that's either Lightning gateways, or it could be just a broker system. Depends on what you want to trust. You could trust the Lightning gateway, and the risks associated with that, or you could just have, it could go all the way to the point where you have a centralized broker who just holds eCash balances of various federations and is acting as a market maker, constantly accepting and forwarding along payments between, different federations eCash, which is an interesting property.
Yeah. And so you have the people who run a given Fedimint have to trust I'm trying to think about how trust flows here. Do they have to trust the liquidity provider? The liquidity provider has to trust the minter? Maybe it's that way?
Yeah, I think yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the right way of putting it. So the Fedimint is trusting that the liquidity providers of, who are forwarding payments along to other federations in some ways will continue to be operating in that function. And then the liquidity providers, they are going to have to trust the federation that they're acting in the best interests of their community as well as their eCash. It's theoretically possible that you could have a federation who just prints a ton of eCash and tries to trade it off to another community, which is a pretty big risk. But I think when you look at free banking systems historically, they didn't really have these types of intermediaries set up this way. And it's really important. It's what prevents a federation from wanting to do that? Well, they're going to lose their market makers pretty quickly.
Yep.
And it's going to be very obvious to the market makers what they're doing. Of course, you're going to have edge cases just as in any free market where things go wrong and people take dumb risks or they set things up and get enough people to believe things. But when we talk about it at a large scale systemically, it would be very hard. You couldn't continuously implement an operation like that.
Right. And you probably couldn't pull it off at the same scale that the single points of, a purely centralized provider in today's world, like an FTX, might try to do. It would presumably have a more natural ceiling on how big these could get and how, before they would sort of want to reconstitute it smaller.
Exactly. There's a bunch of stakeholders with competing interests who all are a part of that process occurring, whereas in FTX, you had SBF doing a bunch of stuff behind the scenes.
Right. Okay, so I think I get some of the basics, the motivation for why these things should exist, some of the features that they hope to express. I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about where we are with respect to this. How long has this been going on and sort of what are the pieces? My understanding is I think Fedimint is a protocol. Fedi is a company. Are there other companies that are implementing this? What does the whole sort of ecosystem look like, and how long have we been progressing on this path?
Yeah. I think so. Fedimint, the protocol, was developed a little over a year ago now by a lot of the folks who are part of Fedi, the company. Fedi, the company, their first go-to-market is going to be basically a wallet that interacts with federations to do, eCash type exchanges, and they're also going to be working with the first few actual mints to get stood up and kind of do some proof of concepts there. Other than Fedi the company, there are, I think, just ideas at this point. I don't know of any other actual formal companies using the protocol yet. I think a lot of that will be coming probably this year as Fedi gets ready to roll out their project and the first few federations get stood up. So it's all very new. It's all a lot of it is theoretical at this point. Talking about, just applications in general that are exciting. One idea that's come up here recently is what's called Fedi pool. And so this would be a way to basically distribute mining pools within Bitcoin. So right now, as you might be aware, there's probably 3 pools that make up the majority of the Bitcoin hash rate. And so the idea of using Fedimint to try to distribute mining pools would be that individual miners could come together, form a Fedimint, and then basically operate their own pool that way. So instead of everybody just trusting, Foundry, for example, to do what's in the best interest of the miners and pay them out, when they find a reward, you would have actual guardians of different mining pool operations be distributed through this Fedimint model. And so I think that could potentially be pretty interesting. And then,
that's kind of I just want to make sure I understand, that's a pretty different thing than kind of the community custody application, right? The kind of mining pooling thing is a pretty different direction this might go.
Yeah, so that would be an example of like an application that could be built on the Fedimint protocol itself.
I see. And the core Fedi, the company that developed the protocol and then is also developing, I guess, Fedi, the application, is that application meant for the community custody idea that you originally were discussing? And then this kind of mining pool thing is more of like a hypothetical, what else can you do with the protocol?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Got it. And so do they have already a hypothesis around what, as a company, they, I think I always find it interesting to think about, businesses in this world where there's like, Bitcoin and everything is kind of open source, and, how do you sort of create and capture value? So do you know if Fedi already has a hypothesis around where they plan to create and capture value within an ecosystem that's otherwise open source?
So I think that, there's, I don't think that they necessarily have like an incredibly long-term plan. I think a lot of it's like, we're building this technology. We have different ideas of what could work, and we're going to, learn through what emerges within the ecosystem and what we're doing and respond to a lot of that. But I think like a good example would be if they're running a wallet that's doing eCash transactions, there might be some very small fee associated with the transactions conducted through the wallet, because there's no blockchain-based fee for sending that. It's just being conducted wallet to wallet. So if a bunch of people are using Fedi the wallet and they take, a few basis points or so on different transactions, that's one example of a business model that could emerge.
I see. And so right now they're not really focused on what the business is. They're focused on trying to get the protocol developed and some of the initial Fedimints stood up so that you can sort of just see how it works and try playing with it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like if we're talking about a system of like transactions, so there's probably some sort of fee-based model that would emerge. And I think that they're thinking that direction, but like the primary thing here is if we can get enough users onboarded, which is going to be a pretty hands-on process, then we could actually, kind of bootstrap this organic demand for the ecosystem. So I'd say that's their primary focus, is making that happen.
And because we think about custody as an important part of this, custody and privacy and the programmability, is the idea that most people who would be a part of the initial installation would be thinking of it as like a bank to store value versus a bank to use eCash for kind of daily expenses? Or is it more for storage and custody, or more for easy access to using it in kind of a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think it's more for the store of value mechanism. So I think the way they kind of see this rolling out is outside of developed countries first, right? So, you think of the global south and you look at examples of countries there that are just being ravished by inflation and horrible fiat currencies, right? So those people need Bitcoin to store their wealth in. But, there's not a lot of wealth in those countries compared to developed countries. And so this model of community custody makes a lot more sense in those parts of the world, at least initially. And so I think the idea would be get some federations stood up, really get that community banking ethos kind of understood by the populations there. Show them, the power of Bitcoin and how it can store your wealth across space and time at first, right? And then probably down the line, introduce some of these more complex financial applications and programmability type things that we've been chatting about.
I see. And so it sounds like a lot of the early potential users of such a system are kind of living in a very different world and have a bunch of different experiences than we have. Maybe there's, less of a established banking system and less of a, I'm not even sure how would they get their first Bitcoin? Like, do they have fiat rails already in some of the places that this is proposed to be useful?
Yep, that's a good question. Yeah, I think there's certain communities that have a pretty good Bitcoin adoption rate, and the way I understand it, those will probably most likely be targeted to be some of the first areas for federations to be kind of bootstrapped.
Does that happen because they have like their own? I've heard and seen some stories around some of the mining stuff that's going on in kind of like stranded energy stuff. Is that the kind of archetype of a community where Bitcoin is already well understood, or at least somewhat understood, but there isn't necessarily a strong fiat on-ramp system?
I think that's a great point. Yeah, I think that's definitely a good example of it. I also think another technology too is Paxful is another good way for a lot of these people to find their onboarding experience. There's definitely like peer-to-peer markets, and from people I've talked to out there as well, Telegram channels are another way that all emerges too. There's a lot of just peer-to-peer conversations happening within those types of communities.
So how does that? I've never quite understood. Obviously, I'm like just some dude who lives in California and like very disconnected from the actual mechanics of how that works. If I were in pick your location in the global South, and I were not connected to I didn't have a fiat or bank account, and I didn't have rails that let me buy Bitcoin, what do I do with Telegram? Am I finding somebody who I can exchange a local currency with to get digital currency? And like, where are they just bringing it in like a brain wallet or something? Or
in terms of like what the specific wallets are that they're using, I think it certainly would depend. But I think like what the majority of people are using down there is mobile money for payments on the M-Pesa. So I think it's a lot of, and I guess I can't really be certain of this, but I think that a lot of it you'd see is people meeting in Telegram groups and saying, I want to sell 200 Bitcoin, meeting up with another person, they send them mobile money, and then they
so they send
a wallet or something,
and then somebody showing up somehow with this digital currency that they can then send to a QR code or something, whatever wallet they're using.
Yeah, just a wallet transaction. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
And then you also have more like formalized peer-to-peer applications such as like Bisq or Peach are a few examples that kind of act as like a reputation system in effect. That way you kind of remove some of the risk of straight peer-to-peer trading where you don't know the other party on the other side of the transaction. So I think it's a combination of all those things.
Yeah.
Right. Got it. And so the it sounds like the early Fedimint users might be there. Are there already kind of like maybe not, places where the use case is not so desperately felt, but that there's sort of like prototype communities that are being stood up just to try to practice the mechanics of how it works? Like, do you guys run one of these yourselves, or do you think you'll run one to play with it?
Yeah, well, once it's more, once like the main net is off and running, yeah, definitely. I think that the first major announcement that they have started to roll out at was Bitcoin Lake in Guatemala. But in terms of the other ones, I know that they have plenty teed up, but none of that's been publicly announced.
And Eric, you sound like you're so deep in this. How did you sort of get into it, and what's sort of your kind of, let's say, interest, or how do you imagine you participate in it going forward?
Yeah, I just think that like when I think about a lot of it just started with my research around the future of Bitcoin and what's going to be happening. And it's basically the way that I see things now is there's kind of this range of outcomes that Bitcoin could turn into. It, the worst case scenario, I don't really see a possibility that Bitcoin fully fails. I think that it's worst case scenarios, it really just becomes like a digital gold 2.0 in some form, and it gets captured by centralized institutions, and people are just using it for the scarcity property. At the other end of the spectrum, we have, a global apolitical monetary system where people are freely transacting between one another without having to depend on very many at all, centralized parties. So, going into my research around how, one, I think that'll pan out, and two, what's kind of needed to get it to the point of being this global apolitical monetary system, that's what ultimately led me to Fedimint and how this could provide a lot of the properties that are necessary when you combine it with Lightning to get Bitcoin to that idea of like a alternative financial system. So I think like if we have the Bitcoin base layer and we have Lightning and we also have Federation set up, we've kind of solved a good amount of the problems. Like if we assume that none of that existed and we're just using, base chain Bitcoin, then, we have transaction throughput issues, which Lightning solves. We have privacy issues, which eCash solves. And then we have programmability issues, which I think eCash or the Fedimint protocol could also solve, as well as Lightning. It's just, I think that it all comes down to what's going to be the most efficient process for that for developers to utilize and where that network effect will build out. But it's like a lot of the things in crypto, I don't think everything is, I think a lot of bad things have happened, but it doesn't mean that every idea was a bad idea. And I think that there's pretty cool ideas that actually have emerged, and those need to be implemented on Bitcoin in the right way. And I saw Fedimint as kind of a potential avenue for that occurring. And so really, like, my view is a lot of the writing that I do is around what the future, quote unquote, banking systems will be for Bitcoin, because we kind of need something to that effect. We have to optimize around certain forms of trust to make all these problems have some form of solution, and what that might look like. And that's what led me there.
Got it. And I know we didn't do real proper intros at the beginning, but do you guys officially work together, or you're kind of social and friends, or sort of what's the, kind of, are you in the investing business, or are you sort of in the development and writing business, or kind of what's your day to day?
We're definitely social friends, and we are also working together too. I guess I'll pass it to Don on that one.
Yeah, nobody listens to your podcast anyway, right, DK? So we can
right, yeah, say whatever you want. I'll just hang out.
Yeah. So Eric and I are in the process of launching a Bitcoin-focused venture fund, and so kind of as we dug into how we think the future of the Bitcoin ecosystem looks, that led us to Lightning and Fedimint and doing a deep dive on all of the peripheral technologies that we think will play into the future of Bitcoin. And I know you and I have chatted about Nostr recently and some of the Web 5 things as well. We think all of these things coming together at this point in time could really lead to some cool opportunities. So we're in the process of launching our fund now. Our name is Epoch. And so Eric and I will be working together on that, and we're pretty excited about the future of Bitcoin.
Cool.
Yep.
On the, a lot of one of the reasons I was pointed to Fedimint is because I've been spending so much time in Nostr, and I mentioned that I have this friend who's like, you can't be spending all this time in Nostr and not care about Fedimint. So I wonder, like, Fedimint sounds interesting, sounds very different than Nostr, but I can see some potential touch points or kind of crossover. And I wonder, do you sort of have a view on what that might look like? And is there a lot of discussion already going on about where Nostr may touch Fedimint or vice versa?
I think a first good example is that you could run a relay on a federation. So that's one example. I think that at a high level, the idea too is that if Fedimint is a system for building financial applications and Nostr is a system that's leveraging those to build other applications, that there's a lot of crossover synergies between user bases between the two things.
And you mentioned kind of the potential coupling between relays and the mints, and I wonder, is there some advantage you get? Like, is it a general network, kind of a default sort of organization principle of the network that would make it attractive to run both a mint and a relay as kind of the same entity, or how do you think about that?
I think it's like if you have hardware that you're setting up to support communities and people already, then you might as well leverage that to the nth degree based on whatever your applications are. So having it set up in a streamlined way so that it supports Bitcoin, it supports Lightning, it supports, Fedimint software, and it supports your peer-to-peer protocol apps, that's kind of like the ideal. And so it's kind of like, an Uber-based model where before we had a bunch of cars sitting around that weren't being utilized, and now we found a way to utilize that infrastructure. I think it'd be kind of like that. If a bunch of people are starting to take their hardware and commit them to these types of systems, that we might as well find a way to do that as most efficiently as possible and not have a bunch of, stranded hardware sitting around. Yeah.
So when I talk to relay operators, at least some of them seem to be very focused on, like, even just making relays scale more is just going to be really painful and they want to keep them very dumb because, any extra logic or intelligence really, they think of it almost more like a router than even like a server, let's say. And so at least there's some idea that, relays should be kept very simple and dumb, and then they should sort of be able to scale themselves. So is there like a tight coupling between the type of people who a given relay operator may choose to support and the type that a Fedimint may choose to support? Like, is it the same kind of, let's say, user base or customer base?
The way I kind of think about the crossover would be like more application specific. Like, so whatever the community of the specific Fedimint is interested in, maybe whatever kind of modules or applications the guardians of that mint find most beneficial for their user base. I think they could potentially use relays specific for those use cases, right? And they may be private relays where they only allow the members of their community to be part of it. And that kind of puts a lid on some of those potential scaling issues at the relay level itself. And then, that also helps prevent the spam problem and things like that. So I think it's probably, at least at the beginning, it'll probably be more specific to the applications that specific mint wants to provide to their user base.
Mm-hmm. And do the guardians have a built-in kind of business model? Like, is there a switch you flip that you collect fees, or you can choose 0 or some amount of fees, or is it more meant to be a volunteer? How should that work?
That's more of like, I think it's more meant to be a volunteer, but it, like, once again, it's just the technology where anything is possible. I think that question comes down to more regulatory. The second there's a profit motive, then that changes the way that a federation would be perceived within different regulatory jurisdictions. So like, if we go to like the community-based piece where it's like, you have a family and you have an account that you're using, then it makes sense because you all gain some sort of ability from doing that together. No profit motive associated with it. You're not charging your kids money to do that for you. Right. That's one example. At the other end, if you have like a commercial scale operation that's doing a profit motive, then that might be in a certain regulatory jurisdiction and might even get certain licenses. There's a lot of things that could emerge.
I see. And yeah, it would seem like to do the large scale one, the only reason they would probably operate is if there were some financial motivation, I guess.
Certainly. Yeah.
Okay. So that sort of, there's some version of this that would be commercializable, but there's also kind of a volunteer one is kind of the default starting point, let's say.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I think it just depends on scale. Doing things out of altruistic sense only goes so far. And so I think that only makes sense in probably the smallest of the small federations. Right. And then once you get beyond that, you're going to want to be compensated for not only your time, but there's going to be hardware costs and software costs involved as well. So I think we'll see it.
I could imagine, would there be customer service too? Like, would a Fedimint have like a helpline you can call or text to get,
exactly.
result?
And I think, talking about integration with Nostr, that could be a perfect use case for like a private relay to function as kind of a customer support communication network.
Yeah, that starts to feel like a reason that maybe paid relays have been becoming popular in the last few weeks, especially. And it seems like a paid relay at some amount of scale probably has some sort of organization around it, right? That figures out how to collect money and how to refund money if the right thing didn't happen, and how to set, it's like, I think, a lot of times in kind of Bitcoin world, and even in like Nostr, we sort of think about these like very hyper efficient engineered systems. Everybody volunteers and contributes wherever they want. But then, when the real world happens and it's not, a bunch of us who kind of like to poke around with it, but it's more like, trying to make it accessible to people who don't really care about the technology and they just want to like get something done, that they often need like a point of contact or some sort of a customer service rep that they can reach out to and get a text message or an email answered. And I could imagine then maybe that a paid relay, maybe that to me feels like a credible reason that like a paid relay and a Fedimint may be operated by the same entity. Yep. Is that kind of how you're seeing it too?
Yep, I think so. I think that makes sense. And then you can also layer in the kind of the one missing piece there is the Lightning service provider role, right? Which could potentially be fulfilled by the same group as well if they're needing to route payments to and from a relay operator or to and from different mints for whatever the use case is. And I think you'll probably also see, a relay operator also be a Lightning service provider, also be part of the mint as well, potentially.
Right. So do you think these end up becoming, I guess maybe it's a broader Nostr Fedimint question, but do you imagine that when these become businesses, there's some kind of natural containment on the scale that they would operate at? Because I can see a natural containment on Fedimint because of the way trust works. Like any given Fedimint probably doesn't get to the same scale as FTX, and that's probably like a good thing. But like relays feel like they could end up being like quite large scale, and maybe they don't monopolize, but they could be really large, I think. And have like teams and maybe corporations that run them. I don't know. So is there some kind of model you have in mind about how these things might actually look like? Do you think they remain, 2, 5, 10 hackers kind of working in a thing, or does someday it looks a little bit more like a, like a scaled tech company?
I think that like for the custodial aspect of it, I think that we'll see a decent degree of decentralization because you're trying to optimize around trust with that. So a lot of that I think will exist within families. You could start to see like smaller scale community credit unions, banking type systems emerge where people are committing funds and the guardians are effectively like a loan board or something. And you could see a lot of that in like global south type economies. And then you could go all the way to the furthest end where we could have large scale federated systems, and those are providing commercial scale services and financial applications that are being used at a large scale, like a decentralized exchange or something like that. So like a federated exchange would be the idea.
Right. And then go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think on the Nostr side and the Lightning service provider side, I do think those probably have a tendency to coalesce around a handful of large players, just based on the unit economics of running a business like that.
Yep.
And I think that's to be perfectly honest, I think that's one of the main challenges with the Lightning network to date. Right, I think it's 40 to 45% of all public traffic within the Lightning network is being routed by nodes that are operated by exchanges, right? So, it's pretty centralized now. Nobody knows exactly how many private channels there are because that's impossible to track. But I mean, as the public capacity grows, if those larger players continue to grow and continue to route the majority of that traffic, that's a concern for the network health in general. And I think that probably also applies to Nostr relays as well. Similar concept.
Right. And so you guys are, I guess, deep in research on this and kind of also in the process of launching a venture fund. And do you imagine that the things that you invest in, do they look kind of like traditional U.S. equities, like a Delaware C Corp that sells you shares, or are there other models that you've heard of that might kind of more appropriately align with the way value is created here?
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things to think about how this whole ecosystem gets built out, right? Because, in our case, yes, we will just be, vanilla equity investors. But in the future, I could see different models taking place, especially outside of the US, where it's more of like a DAO is kind of a dirty word, right? But that similar concept potentially could be the structure that a lot of this takes in the future.
What are the aspects of a DAO that seem appropriate here?
Yeah, I think it's just like the distributed nature of the parties that are involved with the project, as opposed to having, just shares divided up from a C Corp. You have just distributed folks all over the world potentially that, have certain roles within the project, and they're not necessarily compensated based on how many shares of the company they own, like is traditional at this point.
Right. Yeah, I think there's like it's a question I've been noodling on and brainstorming with a bunch of friends lately, because I think there's, I don't know if you saw this note that I wrote where I was, kind of talking to somebody who said like, oh, bounties are way better than, I don't know, venture capital or something. And I kind of take some issue with that because I think bounties serve a different function than venture capital. They're maybe like more near term, more clarified goals of a project with more near-term results, and the risk is borne by the person developing it versus kind of more pooled capital. And I think, the venture capital model works to pool risk with financial partners and maybe allows for longer term things with more diffuse goals. And maybe there's, for all of its flaws, I think sort of the, basic science research that's funded by tax dollars ends up, being very diffuse and hopefully beneficial to society, but is, probably very inefficiently run. And so I could imagine that new models would emerge, but I wonder sort of like how does sort of the risk and reward and kind of return payoff work? I just mentioned three models, right? So like bounties, venture capital, and basic science funded by government. Do you think that sort of among the kind of risk and capital pools, there's something kind of in between the bounties and the venture capital model, or in between the venture capital model and the taxation and government funding, or are there new models that have been proposed that people are sort of noodling on around this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I don't necessarily know of any new models. Kind of the way I think about it is, especially with protocols and ecosystems that are as new as things like Nostr and Fedimint, right? I think the key is just having that long-term relationship with founders and companies that are building on those protocols. And I think, to me, the way that makes the most sense to develop that relationship is through the fund structure, right? You're having 10 plus years to see what that project, aka company, can develop into. And I think, if you compare that to like a bounty model, sure, you're solving for a problem that exists today. But, in startup world, a lot of the times you go through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 iterations before finding product market fit. And so I don't think that the bounty model really makes much sense in that context.
Yeah, it seems like bounties are really good when a problem is well defined and understood, and maybe can be accomplished by maybe one or a small handful of people. I was proposing in that thread. I think it would be hard to it would be hard to do mRNA discovery, or to do rockets to launch satellites with a bounty program. You sort of need other types of risk and pooling to make that work.
I guess kind of the other, model that's out there now is just like funding developers, right? Like you see that in the Bitcoin ecosystem where individuals or not-for-profits or even companies just provide funding to developers to work on Bitcoin Core. I guess that model could potentially continue to spread and grow in the future as well, where it's, not necessarily putting a time or a specific task on the donation, but really just like funding the person.
Right. Have those, I know that, Square Block Spiral has done a lot to show kind of what, one model of that might look like. Has that instigated a broader effort towards that, or are there other people who are coming up and kind of replicating that model in different flavors, or what's sort of your understanding of how that's hit the market?
Yeah. I think there's several like Bitcoin specific not-for-profits that people can donate to that fund development as well. And then on the other side, you have actual companies who might, this goes back to more of like the bounty model, but they might have like certain things they need fixed for their business, right? And they'll put out a kind of a notice to developers that say, hey, we're willing to fund you, but we would like for you to work on this problem in addition to whatever else you're working on as well.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I think how we kind of help nurture this ecosystem in all kinds of ways, are important. Like find the people who have the ideas and the talent, find the capital and the risk and the returns available to the people who are taking the risk, and get the stories told and make it more visible what is happening, so that more people can sort of coalesce and aggregate to help solve these important problems. So it feels like there's innovation in every direction here.
Yep. And I think too, like one thing that, Bitcoin has kind of shown us is that adoption will happen, right? If there's demand for the protocol or for the application. But if you don't have like a central company or central foundation that really drives like the business development and marketing, adoption might happen, slower than it would otherwise. And so I think, when you look at something like a Fedimint, that's one kind of issue that they're trying to fix, which is using, Fedi, the company, is kind of like a business development arm for Fedimint, the protocol and ecosystem itself. And so you're kind of trying to take the model of like what a lot of, crypto projects have used in the past and kind of port that in a more thoughtful way to the Bitcoin ecosystem where, we're not printing money out of thin air to support the foundation, but we're using the model of business development and marketing to try to drive user adoption and developer interest to the ecosystem.
Right. And do you have, right now, if you sort of had to pick, are there milestones for the future that you're attentive or aware of that maybe Fedi is aiming towards, like maybe the first deployment, if it's not already out, like when is that? 3 months out, 6 months out, a year or two? Like,
yeah, it should be within the next quarter or so, I believe. And then, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll see a handful, if not more, of actual federations up and running. And just, for Eric and I, our job here recently has been to try to model out what we think startup growth in the ecosystem looks like, in the Fedimint ecosystem specifically, which is kind of a hard task when it's this early, right? But we think within a couple of years from now, you could have several hundred startups in the space, pretty conservatively.
And do you see yourselves as Fedimint investors, Lightning investors, Bitcoin investors, sort of anything in this open ecosystem, or how do you sort of think about your mandate or charter?
Yeah. So all of the above. And then in addition, we think, kind of like we've touched on a few times, we think some of the peer-to-peer and self-sovereign technologies that are surrounding the ecosystem will really be accretive as well. And so, we're open to investing in projects and companies building on those as well, as long as we think that, the user bases will be cohesive and that they will drive value to each other.
So with those, just to clarify, I've seen or heard of this Keat thing. Would that be the kind of thing that would fit into that broader peer-to-peer mandate you're talking about?
Exactly. Yep. And we could even throw, certain types of hardware in there as well. I mean, you see like, people coming out with like self-sovereign mobile phone technology right now. You see like home servers that people can run various applications on. All those types of things would fit into our mandate.
Cool. So this is super fun. So thanks for coming by and sharing. I think at least I get a little bit more depth on what Fedimint is and sort of its purpose, and kind of more about how you guys are thinking about the ecosystems. That really helps me. Thanks for coming to share your knowledge.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks for having us.